The train whistle echoed through the valley like a long, mournful cry, rattling the windows of the few buildings that made up the settlement. Dust rose from the dirt road as a pair of horses clopped past the general store, their hooves striking against stone. It was a late afternoon in the waning years of the 1800s, and the small American village lay under a sky painted with streaks of orange and gold. Folks here lived simply: blacksmith, preacher, storekeeper, and the handful of ranchers, whose land stretched out far beyond the horizon. Among them was the loner rancher, a man known more for his silence than for any story told about him. He had built his spread with his own hands, fencing the rough land and raising cattle without the help of kin. To many, he seemed hardened as the earth he worked. Yet beneath that grit, he carried a quiet yearning no one could see. For years he had ridden the range alone, fixing fences, branding calves, and chasing off coyotes. He had watched neighbors take wives, watched their families grow, and listened to laughter spilling from windows at night. His own cabin, by contrast, was dark, save for the soft glow of a single lamp. The loneliness settled on him like the dust of the trail, heavily, constantly. And so, one winter, when the idea was planted in his mind by a traveling peddler who spoke of a service that arranged mail-order brides from distant towns, he began to think. He wrote a letter, simple and earnest, to a woman back east. He told her of the land of his hope for a wife to share it, of the steadiness of his character, if not the charm of his words. When her reply came, agreeing to come west, the rancher felt the first flicker of hope in many years. The weeks turned into months as he waited, his life measured by sunrises and cattle drives. Each day he scanned the dusty road for the stagecoach that would carry her. He dreamed of what she might look like, how her voice might sound when she spoke his name, and whether she would find peace on his lonely ranch. He cleaned the cabin, repaired the roof, built a rocking chair for the porch, and even planted flowers by the doorway, a tender gesture for a man not known for softness. The town noticed his preparations, whispered of his bride's arrival, and speculated whether such a solitary man could learn to share his life. At last, the day came. The stagecoach rolled into town, its wheels squeaking, its horses breathing heavy from the long road. Dust swirled around the vehicle as it drew to a halt before the post office, where folks usually gathered to see new arrivals. The rancher stood stiffly by his wagon, hat pulled low, his heart pounding beneath his weathered coat. He expected one woman to step down from the coach, perhaps eager, but certainly his bride. Instead, what he saw froze him in place. Two women emerged, and though they carried separate faces, their bodies were joined at the side, moving as one. The murmurs of the townsfolk spread like wildfire. Children gasped, women clutched their skirts, and men whispered behind their hands. The rancher's eyes locked on them, his heart hammering not from excitement, but from a sudden rush of confusion. He had imagined many things in the long nights of waiting, but nothing like this. The brides stood proudly, their gaze steady despite the weight of the stairs around them. Their dresses were plain, travel-worn, and their faces bore the fatigue of the journey, yet there was a quiet strength about them. They did not flinch, nor did they hang their heads in shame. Instead, they stepped forward together, as if they had walked through the world all their lives as one and expected no less than to be accepted as such. The rancher's throat tightened. He had asked for a wife, and fate had sent him to bound together by birth. In that moment, the careful balance of his world tilted. He wondered if this was a cruel trick, some mistake, or perhaps a test of the lonely prayer he had sent across the miles. The mail-order service had written little beyond a name, and he realized now how little he truly knew. Still, there they were, flesh and blood, standing before him with the same hope in their eyes that he had carried in his chest for months. The crowd waited for his reaction. Some smirked, expecting him to turn away. Others shook their heads, certain the loner rancher would never accept such a twist of fate. The bride's hands clasped tightly together, though that was nothing new to them. What was new was the weight of a stranger's decision hanging in the air. The rancher shifted his boots in the dust, his hat brim shadowing his expression. His heart told him to speak, to step forward, yet his mind spun with questions. Could he welcome them into his home? Could a man so set in his solitary ways embrace? A pair of brides joined in body and soul. The stagecoach driver cleared his throat and began unloading their trunks, the sound of wood striking dirt breaking the silence. The brides did not move, waiting. The townsfolk leaned closer, breathless with curiosity. The rancher's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the brim of his hat. This was not what he had waited for, not the picture he had painted in his heart. But sometimes the frontier gave a man not what he wanted, but what he needed or what he must endure. His voice caught before it could rise. The brides looked at him, their expressions a mix of fear and quiet defiance. He could see that they too had risked everything, had left behind all they knew to come west for a chance at belonging. Perhaps they feared rejection more than the long journey they had just endured. Perhaps they already carried scars deeper than the eyes of the crowd could see. The rancher felt the weight of choice pressed down on him like a mountain. His future stood before him, not in one figure, but in two bound together. And he could not yet tell whether it was a gift, a burden, or both. The dust hung in the air, the horses stamped impatiently, and the sun slipped lower toward the horizon. The rancher finally lifted his head, meeting their gaze. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words would not come. The village, the brides, and the open land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would decide. And in that fragile silence, the story of his life found theirs, titled on the edge of something no one could yet name. The rancher did not speak right away. His throat felt dry as he studied the women before him. The crowd behind him shifted uneasily, their whispers sharp in the heavy air. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with wonder, while old men squinted and spat tobacco into the dirt. Everyone wanted to see what choice the loner rancher would make, yet he said nothing. He only nodded once to the driver, who had set their trunks by the road, and then turned back to his wagon. His boots crunched against gravel as he walked. The silence around him louder than the stagecoach wheels had been. The women stood there still, the brim of their bonnets shading their tired faces, but their gaze followed him. One lifted her chin slightly, the other pressed her lips together, though both sets of eyes held the same question. What happens now? The rancher reached his wagon, rested his hand on the sideboard, and hesitated. He could feel the weight of the town stairs on his back, pressing into him like needles. His life had been lived outside of people's judgment. He was used to solitude, to decisions that mattered only to him and his cattle. But now, every man, woman, and child seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what sort of man he truly was. At last, he turned. His voice was steady, though low. "You'd best get your trunks loaded." That was all he said, but it was enough to make the townsfolk gasp. The women exchanged a glance and unspoken language they must have carried between them since birth, and then stepped forward together. Their skirts brushed the dirt as they moved, their hands resting lightly against one another, though there was no space between. They walked as one, sure and certain. The rancher lifted their trunks into the wagon bed. They were heavier than he expected, filled not just with belongings, but, he thought, with the weight of whatever lives they had left behind. He offered a hand to help them climb up, but they managed without him, steady in their practiced rhythm. Once seated, they folded their hands in their laps and waited, quiet as the prairie wind. He took the reins, climbed onto the seat, and clucked to the horses. The wagon jolted forward, wheels crunching over the dirt road. Behind them, the townsfolk slowly dispersed, their curiosity fed but not satisfied. The whispers would not end tonight. They would grow, spread, and become stories told in the barber shop, the saloon, and the church pews. But the rancher did not look back. The road out of town stretched long and empty, lined with sagebrush and cottonwoods, the river glinting in the distance. The bride sat close behind him, their presence heavy but silent. He could feel their eyes on his back, and though he wished to say something, no words came. He had not prepared for this, no man could have. He had prepared for one woman, not to bound together in such a way. His thoughts drifted as the horses trotted steady. He remembered his own boyhood, years spent in a house filled with silence after his mother passed. His father too stern to speak much. Loneliness had been his earliest companion. When he grew old enough, he left that house carrying the silence with him to the wide land. Ranching gave him purpose, but it did not fill the empty spaces inside. The letter he had sent eastward had been an act of courage, though he hadn't thought of it that way at the time. He simply knew he could not keep living without some light to break the solitude. And now, the light had arrived in an unexpected form. He glanced back once, his eyes catching the brides for the first time without the filter of shock. Their faces were not unkind. They were plain, yes, but in the way of honest women who had known hard work. One had hair slightly darker than the other, though their expressions mirrored one another in a strange harmony. They did not seem afraid, nor ashamed, only weary from the road. Still, he wondered what their lives had been before, what choices had led them to answer his letter. The ranch stretched wide as they drew closer, the fence lines running like ribs across the land. The cabin sat sturdy against the horizon, smoke still curling from the chimney where he had stoked the fire that morning. A few cattle dotted the pasture, tails swishing against flies. To him, it was home. To them, it might seem empty, even harsh. He slowed the wagon as they reached the yard, the horses stamping restlessly. The brides looked at the cabin, their faces unreadable. He climbed down, lifted their trunks once more, and set them on the porch. The women stepped down carefully, skirts brushing the dust. They paused before the doorway, as if uncertain whether to cross the threshold. He held the door open, though. He said nothing. They entered together, the room darkening for a moment as their figures blocked the fading light. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and smoke. The chairs he had built sat neatly by the table, the rocking chair angled toward. The window and the flowers he had planted brightened the sill. He had done it all for a wife, but the thought came unbidden, was it enough for two? The brides moved quietly through the room, their steps measured. They looked at the shelves he had stocked, the quilt folded on the bed, the Bible resting on the mantel. One of them touched the rocking chair lightly, as if testing its strength. The other glanced toward the window, where the last of the sunset painted the plains in red and gold. Neither spoke. He cleared his throat, awkward in his own. Home. It's not much, but it's honest. You'll be comfortable enough. He meant the words kindly, but they fell flat in the silence. The women turned their eyes to him, and in them he saw questions he could not yet answer. That night he sat outside on the porch while the lamp glowed faintly inside. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. He rolled a cigarette between his fingers, but did not light it. Our sots circled like hawks overhead. The brides had taken to the cabin quietly, unpacking their trunks, arranging their things with practiced ease. They did not complain, nor did they weep. But their silence carried a weight, as though they too were waiting for what he could not say. The village would not let this pass quietly. He knew the whispers would soon reach the preacher, and from there, judgment would fall. People out here were not unkind, but they were not forgiving of what they did not understand. A loner. Rancher taking a mail-order bride was one thing. Taking two, bound together as one, was another matter altogether. Already he could imagine the sideways glances in the church pews, the muttered words in the saloon. And worse, he could imagine the sting of pity, something he had spent his life avoiding. Still, as the crickets sang in the grass and the cool night wrapped around him, a thought rooted itself deep in his chest. These women had come across miles of rough country, knowing they would be judged, knowing they would be stared at, perhaps even rejected. Yet they had come anyway. That kind of courage was not small. Perhaps it was the kind of courage he had been missing all along. Inside, he heard the floorboards creak as the brides moved about, their steps echoing together. He closed his eyes, listening. Tomorrow he would have to face the town again. Tomorrow the questions would come, and tomorrow he would have to decide what sort of man he truly was. For now he sat in the quiet, the lamp glowing warm behind the window, and wondered what secrets the dawn might bring. When he finally went inside, the room was dim. The brides had laid out their belongings, small things that spoke of another. Life, a worn book, a folded ribbon, a tin box scratched with initials. They looked up when he entered, their faces soft in the lamplight. For a moment there was no judgment, no whispers. No crowd, only the three of them in the cabin, bound by chance, by choice, or by fate. And though he did not yet know it, the hardest days were still ahead. The land was not kind to weakness, and neither was the village. Somewhere beyond the fences, storms gathered, both in the sky and in the hearts of those who would not understand. The rancher felt it in his bones that the arrival of these brides had set something in motion that could not be undone. He removed his hat, set it on the table, and looked at them one last time before the lamp was turned low. Their eyes followed him, steady and unyielding. The silence stretched, filled with questions yet to be asked, and answers that would not come easily. The night wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The rancher lay awake long after the lamp went out, listening to the sound of two breaths moving together in the darkness. Somewhere, far away, the coyotes cried into the night. And he knew, with a heaviness in his chest, that nothing about his life or theirs would ever be the same again. The next morning broke with a pale light spreading across the plains, the sun pushing slowly. Above the horizon, the rancher was already awake, his boots laced, his hat pulled down against the early chill. He had not slept well. The sound of the two women breathing in rhythm through the night had unsettled him. Not because it was loud, but because it was constant, a reminder that he was no longer alone. For years, the cabin had echoed with nothing but the creak of timbers and the wind through the chinks in the walls. Now it carried the faint rustle of skirts, the soft thud of two sets of steps moving as one. He stepped outside into the crisp air. The sky still streaked with pink. The cattle lowed in the distance, restless for their feed. He grabbed a bucket, ready to fetch water from the well, when he paused. Behind him, the door opened, and the brides stepped into the morning light. They wore fresh dresses, plain but clean, and their hair was neatly braided. Their faces looked drawn from the long journey. Yet there was something steady in their bearing, as though the land itself could not shake them. The rancher studied them from under his hat brim. They looked at the corral, at the wide fields stretching out, at the fences that marked the edge of his hard work. One of them tilted her head slightly, and though neither spoke, he sensed they were already judging the life they had come into. He wondered what they saw, an empire of freedom or a prison of dirt and endless labor. He set down the bucket and motioned toward the barn. "There's chores enough. They'll get to know this place fast." His voice was flat, but it carried. "Wait." The women exchanged that silent glance again, and then nodded together. They followed him into the barn where the scent of hay and livestock filled the air. The chickens clucked nervously as they entered, and the horses stomped in there. Stalls as the day wore on, he saw something in them that surprised him. They worked without complaint. When he asked them to gather eggs, they did so carefully. When he showed them how to milk the cow, their movements were clumsy at first, but soon grew sure. Their joined bodies moved in a rhythm born of years of practice, and what might have looked awkward to others became almost graceful in its efficiency. They knew how to share tasks, how to lean on one another without words. By midday, they had done more than he expected, and he caught himself watching them longer than he intended. But as the sun reached its peak, a dust cloud rose on the road. He straightened, narrowing his eyes. It was the preacher's buggy, and behind it rode a couple of townsmen on horseback. The rancher's jaw tightened. He had known the village would not leave this matter be. The buggy rolled to a halt at the gate, and the preacher stepped down, his black coat stirring in the breeze. He was a tall man with stern eyes that softened only in the pulpit. The two townsmen dismounted, standing with arms crossed. Watching closely, "Morning," the preacher called, though his tone carried no warmth. "I hear you brought brides from back east." His eyes flicked toward the women who stood near the barn, their hands still dusted with hay. The rancher nodded once. "That's right." The preacher's gaze lingered on the women, his lips pressing thin. "And I also hear they are joined. Is that true?" The rancher said nothing for a moment, his hand tightening on the fence rail. "You can see plain enough." The preacher shifted, his voice lowering. "This is a God-fearing community. Folks will talk. They'll want to know what place such an arrangement has among us." The rancher's chest burned, but he kept his words even. They came to be wives. That's their place. The townsmen exchanged looks, and one spat into the dirt. The preacher folded his hands. "I'll need to speak with them. Alone." The bride stepped forward, their faces calm, though their eyes were watchful. The rancher moved to block the preacher's path. "They answered to me. They'll not be questioned like cattle on market day." The preacher's brows drew together, but he did not push further. "We'll talk again," he said finally. He mounted his buggy, the townsmen swinging back into their saddles. As they rode away, dust rising behind them, the rancher felt the tension ease from his shoulders, though not fully. The message was clear. The town would not accept this quietly. That night, as the fire burned low, the rancher sat at the table with the women across from him. The lamplight flickered over their faces, showing the weariness in their eyes. He spoke gruffly, but with an edge of concern. "Town's watching. They'll keep testing. You ready for that?" One of the brides nodded slowly, and the other added in a quiet voice, "We've been tested all our lives." Their words carried truth, and he could not help but respect it. Yet it also deepened the unease in his chest. Days turned to weeks, and the ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. The brides learned quickly, cooking meals, mending clothes, and even helping mend fences when the need arose. Their strength was not in brute force, but in endurance, in their ability to move as one without faltering. Still, the whispers in town grew louder. The blacksmith told customers he'd never seen such a thing. The saloon filled with jokes and crude remarks. Mothers drew their children away when the brides walked down the street. The preacher's sermons turned sharper, filled with talk of purity and God's order. The rancher tried to ignore it, but it wore at him. He had always lived apart from the town, content in his solitude. Now, through no fault of his own, he found himself at the center of its attention. Every trip for supplies was marked by stares. Every Sunday service was a battlefield of silence and judgment. The brides, though quiet, bore it with dignity, their eyes forward, their heads held high. Yet he saw the tightness in their hands, the slight tremble when they returned home. In the midst of this tension, a new problem arose. A neighboring rancher, a man with a sharp tongue and sharper temper, began eyeing the loner's land. He had long wanted to expand his herd, and he saw opportunity in the whispers against the rancher. At the saloon, he told others the loner had made a fool of himself, that he had no right to land when he couldn't even choose a proper wife. His word spread, and soon men began to talk of buying him out. One evening, after a long day of riding fence lines, the rancher returned to find the brides standing on the porch, their faces pale. A dead calf lay in the yard, a crude message carved into its hide: "Leave." His stomach clenched. He scanned the horizon, but whoever had done it was long gone. The brides looked at him, their eyes wide but steady. "This is only the beginning," one of them whispered. He buried the calf that night under the cottonwood by the creek, the bride standing silently nearby. As he shoveled the dirt back over the small body, he felt the weight of the conflict settling over his shoulders like a storm cloud. He had wanted a wife to ease his solitude. Instead, he had brought upon himself a battle with the town, with his neighbors, and perhaps even with the land itself. Yet, as the moon rose high, he caught sight of the brides' faces in the pale light. They did not shrink from the sight of the grave, nor from the anger burning in his eyes. They stood firm, their hands linked, their gaze steady. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps they had been sent not to soften his life, but to strengthen it. Still, the question of how far the town would go lingered like a thorn in his mind. Would they stop at whispers? Would they push harder until something broke? The rancher could not yet see the answer. All he knew was that the conflict had only begun, and every choice from now on would shape not just his life, but theirs as well. The prairie wind howled that night, rattling the shutters and moaning through the chimney. The brides slept inside, their breathing soft, while the rancher sat awake by the dying fire, a rifle across his knees. He could not tell if he was guarding against coyotes, neighbors, or something greater, but the unease in his chest told him danger was close, and somewhere in the dark, unseen eyes might already have been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nights grew heavier with silence, and the rancher felt the weight of each one pressing down on him. The townsfolk had not eased. If anything, the whispers sharpened into open stares, and the stares sharpened into threats. When he rode into town for supplies, the shopkeeper's smile had turned forced, the coins counted out with stiff fingers. In the saloon, laughter followed him as soon as he stepped through the door, men leaning on the counter, their voices just loud enough for him to hear. He did not fight, not yet. But the fire inside him burned hotter each day. The brides kept to themselves, working with steady rhythm, though he noticed the wear in their faces. They carried themselves with dignity. But even dignity was tiring when the world pressed so hard against it. At times, he caught them sitting together on the porch in the evening, whispering to each other in voices too soft for him to catch. Their heads bowed close, as if keeping some secret that gave them strength. He wondered if they regretted their journey west, if they wished they had chosen another man, another place, another fate. The calf left dead in his yard had been the first strike, but not the last. One morning, he found the fence line cut, his cattle scattered across the open plain. It took him 2 days to round them back, and even then, a pair were missing. He knew they hadn't wandered. Someone had driven them off. When he returned to the ranch, dust-caked and weary, he saw the worry in the bride's eyes before they spoke a word. They had felt the danger, too. That night, he loaded his rifle, setting it against the wall by the door. He sat long into the hours, listening to the coyotes cry. But this time, it wasn't coyotes that troubled him. It was men neighbors, townsfolk, men who felt justified by the preacher's sharp words and their own envy of his land. The prairie had always been hard, but now it was turning cruel, shaped by whispers and fear. The preacher visited again, this time without company. He came on a Sunday afternoon, his black coat dusted from the road, Bible in hand. He stood on the porch, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. The rancher met him there, his body blocking the doorway. The brides stayed inside, their faces visible through the small window. "You cannot go on like this," the preacher said quietly. "The town will not stand for it." The rancher's jaw tightened. "The town doesn't get to choose who I live with." The preacher's voice was calm, but there was iron in it. "This is not about choice. It's about order. About what is right in the eyes of God." He opened his Bible, though he did not read. "You're testing the patience of your neighbors. A man alone may live how he pleases, but once he sets an example others find dangerous, he invites ruin." The rancher stepped closer, his shadow falling across the preacher. "You think I'm afraid of ruin? I've lived with it all my life. I'll stand against it now, same as before." The preacher closed the book slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the bride stood. His voice softened, though it carried a hidden edge. "You may be strong enough to face ruin, but are they?" The rancher felt his stomach twist. Though he didn't let it show, he turned away, his voice low. "You best leave." The preacher did, but the warning clung to the ranch like smoke. That night, the bride sat with him by the fire. They did not speak much, but their presence filled the room with an unspoken resolve. He realized then that they were not fragile, not weak. They had crossed miles of unforgiving country, knowing the world would look at them with judgment. They were not strangers to ruin either. Days later, trouble came again. He was out mending a fence when he saw dust rising in the distance. 3 riders, their faces hidden under wide brims, moving fast toward the ranch. His chest clenched. He dropped the hammer, grabbed his rifle from the saddle, and mounted up. By the time he reached the yard, the riders were already circling the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting, their voices raised in taunts. The bride stood on the porch, arms wrapped tightly together, their eyes fixed on the men. One of the riders laughed harshly. "Didn't know you were running a circus out here?" Another spat in the dirt. "Place like this ought to belong to real men, not someone hiding behind freaks." The rancher rode straight in, rifle resting across his saddle. His voice was cold as steel. "You best turn around." The laughter faltered, but only for a moment. One of the riders nudged his horse closer. "Or what? You'll shoot us in front of your brides." The rancher didn't flinch. He cocked the rifle, the sound cracking sharp in the air. "I said turn." For a long moment, the yard held its breath. The brides stood silent, the riders' horses shifting nervously. Finally, the lead rider spat again, tugged his reins, and wheeled his horse away. The others followed, dust clouding behind them as they rode off. But the rancher knew this was no victory. It was only a pause, a test of how far he would go. They would be back. That evening, the ranch was tense, the air heavy with the threat of what was to come. The brides moved quietly, their faces pale, though their eyes still burned with that steady fire. The rancher tried to hide his worry, but he knew they saw it anyway. As they sat together at the table, the sound of the wind rattling the windows, one of the brides finally spoke. "They will not stop." The words landed heavy. The rancher looked at them both, their faces nearly identical in the lamplight, their hands resting together on the table. He wanted to promise safety, to tell them he would shield them from whatever came, but he could not lie. They all knew the truth. The town's fear had turned to anger, and anger had already turned to action. The days that followed stretched thin. The rancher worked the fields with rifle always within reach. He rode fence lines, eyes scanning the horizon for riders. The brides kept close to the cabin, but he saw the weight in their faces deepen. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, spooked at shadows, restless at night. The prairie wind carried more than dust, it carried tension. thick as storm clouds gathering above, and then the storm broke. It was near midnight when the first sound came, a horse's whinny, sharp and urgent. The rancher jolted from the chair, where he'd been dozing, hand closing around the rifle. He stepped to the window. Out beyond the yard, torches flickered in the dark, weaving like fireflies. And the distant murmur of men's voices rose. His chest tightened. They were coming, not one or two, but many, more than he had expected. He turned toward the brides. They were already awake, standing by the bed, their faces pale but steady in the lamplight. The glow of fire outside reflected in their eyes. The rancher's voice was rough. "Stay inside." He stepped out into the night, the cold air cutting, sharp against his skin. The yard was alive with shadows, men on horseback, their torches casting wild light across the land. The preacher was there, his black coat stark in the glow, his face unreadable. The others were neighbors, men he had once nodded to in passing, now standing together with hard eyes. One of them called out, "This ends tonight." The rancher raised his rifle, the weight of it steady in his hands, though his heart pounded like a drum. The brides stood just inside the doorway, the lamplight spilling around them, their faces lit by both fear and resolve. The torches crackled, the horses stamped, and the prairie wind howled through the night like a warning. The rancher drew a breath, his voice carrying over the fire and the dark. "If you want to take this place, you'll have to come through me." The words struck the air like iron, and for a heartbeat, everything went still. The riders shifted, the preacher's eyes glinted, the brides gripped each other's hands tighter, their bodies tense against the storm. The prairie night hung suspended, heavy with danger, every soul waiting for the first spark that would set everything ablaze. The standoff seemed to stretch into eternity. Torches flickered, casting tall shadows against the cabin walls, and the cold prairie wind hissed through the grass. The rancher stood steady in the yard, rifle raised, his boots planted in the dirt. His heart thundered, but his face showed no fear. Behind him, the brides stood framed by the doorway, their joined hands gripped tight, their eyes shining in the firelight. They did not cower. They did not hide. The preacher was the first to step forward, his face drawn hard with lines of resolve. His voice carried across the dark. "This is not the way of our people. What you've brought here is a stain on this community. The town cannot abide it." The rancher's voice came low but sharp. "You talk about community. What about kindness? What about respect? These women came across miles for a chance at a home. I asked for a bride, and they answered. They've done no harm to anyone. If you think that makes us a stain, then you're looking at the world all wrong." The men shifted uneasily, their torches trembling in their grips. Some muttered, others spat into the dirt, but none rode forward. The preacher's jaw tightened. "You think your defiance makes you strong, but you're alone in this fight." The rancher's grip tightened on the rifle. "I've been alone most my life, but I'm not alone now." He glanced back at the brides. Their steady presence behind him gave his words weight. "If you want to burn me out, you'll have to look them in the eyes while you do it. They're not a curse. They're people same as you, and I won't let you treat them as anything less." A long silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the wind and the crackle of torches. Then one of the older townsmen coughed. "Preacher, maybe we're going too far," he muttered. Another rider shifted in his saddle. "Ain't like there." Hurting nobody, the uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Men who had come with fire in their bellies now stared at the brides, their faces pale, their eyes meeting the women's with a mixture of shame and discomfort. The preacher's eyes darkened. He raised his Bible high, his voice sharp. "God will judge those who twist his creation." The bride stepped forward, their voices finally rising. One spoke first, her tone firm but calm. "We did not choose how we were born, but we chose to be here. We chose to answer when this man called for a wife. Does that make us less? Does it make us strong enough to live despite what others would call us?" The other bride lifted her chin, her voice steady. "We've been judged since the day we were born, but we are not ashamed. We will not be hidden." Their words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Even the preacher faltered for a heartbeat. The townsfolk shifted, glancing at one another, unsure of how to answer. What they saw before them was not a monster, not a curse, but two women standing in dignity, daring them to look deeper. The rancher lowered his rifle just slightly, though his voice still cut like steel. "You wanted to test me. You wanted to test them. Well, you've got your answer. We're not leaving. This is our home now." The preacher's face hardened, but he saw the doubt in the eyes of the men around him. One by one, they lowered their torches. Horses shifted, hooves clattering nervously. The preacher's voice wavered with anger, but the strength behind it had cracked. At last, he snapped the Bible shut and turned away. "This isn't finished," he muttered, climbing into his buggy. But the men who had followed him did not echo his threat. They turned their horses toward town, their torches flickering out against the dark. The rancher stood in the yard long after they were gone, the rifle still in his hands. The prairie night was silent again, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the lowing of cattle in the distance. Slowly, he turned back toward the cabin. The bride stood waiting, their faces calm but pale, their hands still clasped tightly together. For the first time in weeks, the rancher felt the burn in his chest ease. Inside, the fire was low, the lamplight soft. They sat together at the table, no words spoken for a while. At last, the rancher broke the silence. "You were brave tonight. Braver than any of them out there." His voice was rough, but there was a gentleness in it too. One of the brides smiled faintly. "We've had practice," the other added softly. "But we were not alone this time." He looked at them then, really looked, and understood something he hadn't before. They were not just the answer to his loneliness. They were his equal in struggle, his partners in a world that demanded courage to survive. He had thought he was the one offering them shelter. But perhaps it was the other way around too. In the days that followed, the town was quieter. The preacher still spoke sharply from the pulpit, but the words carried less weight. Some of the townsfolk softened, offering nods instead of stares, or quick greetings instead of silence. Others kept their distance, but they no longer came with torches or threats. The danger had not vanished, but the worst had passed. The ranch settled into a rhythm again. Fences mended, cattle grazed, chores were done. The brides tended the cabin with care, planting more flowers by the doorway, hanging laundry in the bright air. Sometimes they walked into town together, their heads held high. People still stared, but the whispers were fewer now. The rancher walked beside them, and though his silence remained, it carried a strength that needed no words. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of gold and red, the three of them sat on the porch together. The land stretched wide before them, endless and open. The brides leaned close, their voices quiet. "Do you regret sending that letter?" The rancher thought of the months of waiting, the shock at the stagecoach, the whispers, the threats, the night when fire nearly consumed everything. Then he looked at them, two women who had crossed the country, who had faced the world's cruelty with dignity, who now sat beside him in the fading light. He shook his head slowly. "No, I reckon it brought me what I needed, even if it wasn't what I expected." The brides exchanged a look, then smiled faintly. For a long moment, the silence between them was not heavy, but full, like the land after a storm. The prairie wind carried the scent of grass and earth. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, and the stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Life on the frontier was never easy. It was a land of hardship, of storms and droughts, of neighbors who judged too quickly and of loneliness that pressed like iron. But it was also a land of second chances, of courage carved into the dust, of love that grew not in perfection but in resilience. The rancher had asked for one bride and had been given to bound together. And in their presence, he found not only companionship but a lesson in strength. The story of the loner rancher and his conjoined brides would live on in whispers, in curious glances, in stories told by firelight. But those who looked closer would see something else, a home built not on fear, but on defiance, dignity, and the quiet endurance of the human heart. As night deepened, the rancher leaned back in his chair, the brides beside him, their hands linked as always. The lamp inside the cabin glowed warm, the flowers on the sill swayed in the breeze, and the wide land stretched out before them like a promise. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together, and in that vast, untamed land the loner rancher was lonely no more.